don't know that I have actually shared this story on any other videos that I've done. So I want to do a recording of just this story. Kenny and I both walked our own journeys. There was a lot of similarities in the reasons that we decided to leave the Church of Christ, but there was also, we each had our own unique, journey through that. Um, I tend to be a thinker. Um, if something happens that doesn't make sense, I tend to um, just kind of sit and mull it over. And I think Kenny handles things differently. But I only say that because for each of us, there were several layers, several reasons that led up to us ultimately making the decision that we can't stay at the Church of Christ anymore. It was such a hard decision. But one of the things with me personally, and this is, this is a very personal story, especially with me being a woman and how some of the unique challenges, if you will, that women who are in an extremely patriarchal system are viewed. And if anyone who knows me and knows my personality, they may find this story surprising. And it is it's still for me a hard pill to swallow, because I really went through a period of feeling stupid, feeling duped. Like, why did I fall for this? But you live and learn. So what's the story? So we spent about 6 months staying at home and just studying. And during that time, we had quite a few Bible studies with Church of Christ preachers. And this one Church of Christ preacher, it's actually the one that we initially met. I want to say this was maybe only the second Bible study that we had with him. So it was very early on. But I remember we were all gathered around our kitchen table, and I want to try to take you into where my mind was at that time. We had just left our church community of 17 years, and our slate had been kind of wiped clean. Kenny and I were both ready to start over. We were so eager to dig into the word, and we were also stepping into a huge unknown. When you leave the only community you've ever known, really the only religious community you've ever known, it's very scary. And so when we had realized that there was so much false teaching that we had been under, I think when you realize that you're under any amount of false teaching, there's a tendency to throw off all of it. I think that's just natural. And of course it's wrong. And we quickly realized that, obviously not everything we learned at our old church was wrong, not even close. But there was a phase that we went through where I think both of us were just like ready to completely start over, and so that was my mindset. I was ready to accept that I had been wrong about all these things, right? And so we're sitting at this second Bible study with this Church of Christ preacher, and it's him and his wife and me and Kenny sitting at our kitchen table. And he looked up and he said, Kenny, would you like to lead us off in prayer? And Kenny looked at me because he had prayed the last time. And in our family, we all take turns praying. We always have, whether it's for meals or Bible study or whatever. That's just how we've always done things. And so when this Church of Christ preacher looked at Kenny and said, would you like to open our study up in prayer? And Kenny looked at me and said, hey, why don't you pray this time? Because that's how we've always done things. And the Church of Christ preacher kind of gently interrupted him and said, well, according to 1 Timothy 2:8, God desires men to pray in all places. And I literally took it with no qualms. He quoted a Bible verse. He basically 1 Timothy 2:8, the verse he quoted, and I'm reading out of the New Living Translation, which is more of a paraphrase, but I'll just use it for now. It says, that verse, the whole verse, says, in every place of worship, I want men to pray with holy hands lifted up to God, free from anger and controversy. So not only did that preacher only grab one verse, he actually only grabbed a snippet of that verse. He looked at me and he said, well, according to 1 Timothy 2:8, God desires men to pray in all places. And that was such a butchering of that verse. But at the time, he seemed like he was quoting a verse, and I listened to him. And what is extremely sad to me is, and this was in January of 2022, from that day, I stopped leading prayer in our home. And I didn't do it out of resentment. I did it with a mindset of reverence. I wanted to be respectful. I wanted to be in my proper place. I wanted to please God. It was done from a place of wanting to do what was right. I remember, oh gosh, we had maybe been in the Church of Christ for a year, and we were all sitting at the dinner table one night, me, Kenny, and the two boys. And Kenny said, would someone like to bless the meal? And I think it was Aiden that volunteered. And right before Aiden started praying, Anson piped up and he goes, why doesn't Mom pray anymore? And like, it literally broke my heart. But I said, honey, because God desires men to pray in all the places. And I quoted that same verse, that same snippet of a verse to my youngest boy. And I explained to him why it's not Mommy's place to pray. And the way it was explained, if you ask any preacher or anybody really from a non-institutional Church of Christ, which again is the most conservative of the groups, most of them will say, or they'll explain, that a woman cannot pray in the presence of a baptized man because that would be her having authority over that man. And I just accepted all of this. And it, what frustrates me is when we left the prosperity gospel, Kenny and I both said, we're never again going to just take somebody's word for it. We're going to check into it. And what did we do? We fell right back into the same pattern of what had happened is those Church of Christ preachers had gained our trust very early on, and we just fell right in line. We didn't question anything. And I'm not saying that they had done that in a predatory manner or a deceptive manner. Maybe they did. I don't know, but that's not the point here. Is they gained our trust and we trusted them. We didn't question the teaching from that point on. And that's what happens so often in these high control religious groups. You just don't question the leadership. Whatever the group's interpretation is of a scripture, you just go with it. And so I wanted to share this story because that one verse quoted out of context by a Church of Christ preacher that had gained our trust destroyed my prayer life until the summer of 2024. And I'll never forget that day. I was sitting at the kitchen table by myself. I decided I was going to read my Bible. Just, sometimes I have a hard time focusing on reading. And so I have to, nobody can be in the house or I get distracted easily. But I remember that day I decided to read the entire book of First Timothy. Well, okay, let me rephrase. That's actually not how it started out. I decided to read all of chapter 1 of all of chapter 2. So I decided to read all of First Timothy chapter 2. And when I read the entire chapter and I came to that verse, it hit me. I'm like, wait a minute. That verse was given to me to show me and to prove that God doesn't want me to pray. God wants the man to pray. And so I was like, okay. So I went back and I read the entire book of First Timothy. Like because that's just what I do. Like if I see that something has been given to me wrong, I'm going to go back and check out the whole thing. And I think we should all do that, by the way. I'm not picking on the Church of Christ, and I've said this so many times. I probably say it in every audio I do. I'm not trying to pick on the Church of Christ. This was just our community for almost 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years. So I lived this. But what I saw from early on, these Church of Christ preachers would tell us, and they actually validated a lot of the concerns that we had with the prosperity gospel, because they are actually the ones that showed us that the word of faith prosperity type movements will grab verses and use them out of context. And so it was, we felt that because they were so adamant on using verses in context, I think there's just an assumption that they're actually doing it. You know what I mean? And because they preached context so much, we never questioned, at least for a while, that maybe they weren't using verses in their proper context. And so when I stumbled upon 1 Timothy chapter 2 this one particular day, and I read all of chapter 2 and realized that verse had been given to me grossly out of context. And then I went and read the entire book of Timothy, and then I read 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and then I proceeded to read them 2 or 3 more times because that's just my obsessive way. Then it began to be it began to be its own cycle of grief when I realized that how much they had robbed me of my prayer life for simply grabbing a snippet of a verse out of context and telling me that I could not lead prayer. I could not lead prayer in front of a man. And so I want to do this audio to encourage, especially women, don't just blindly follow leaders. And this is not said in a disrespectful way. We all need to be Bereans. And just because you trust somebody doesn't mean that you shouldn't check up on what they're telling you. There's a lot of people I've known with good intentions that gave me bad information. And if there's anything that this experience has taught both of us, it's that you have to check things out. So this was an example, a very personal example of how a trusted preacher quoting a verse out of context quite literally destroyed my prayer life for more than 2 years. And I don't want that to happen to somebody else.